A white cop shaves black twins' hair, laughing as he humiliates them in front of the entire station. To him, she's just another kid who needs to be put in her place. But the moment he steps out of that room, everything changes. Because these aren't just any girls, and they aren't alone. Their father is one of the most powerful men in the country, and now he's coming for justice. What happens when a man who thought he was untouchable realizes he's made the biggest mistake of his life? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The evening air wrapped around Maya and Zuri Carter like a warm blanket as they stepped out of their friend Jessica's house. The sun was setting, painting the upscale neighborhood in soft orange and purple hues. Perfectly manicured lawns stretched out before them, and luxury cars sat in circular driveways like sleeping giants. Maya nudged her sister's shoulder. "I still can't believe you said that to her mom about the cucumber sandwiches." Zuri's usually serious face broke into a rare smile. Well, they were a bit dry. Their laughter, though quiet, carried across the empty street. Maya quickly lowered her voice, remembering their father's lessons. FBI Chief James Carter's words echoed in her mind. Be aware. Be smart. Be safe. The twins walked side by side on the pristine sidewalk, careful to maintain a steady, purposeful pace. Neither wore their hoodies up, despite the cooling evening air, another of their father's rules. Their shadows stretched long behind them as they passed beneath regularly spaced street lamps that were just beginning to flicker to life. "We should have let Jessica's mom drive us," Zuri said softly, her analytical mind always working. "It's getting dark." Maya shook her head. "It's only 7:30 and it's not that far. Besides, we've walked this way dozens of times." The quiet neighborhood seemed to hold its breath around them. The only sounds were their footsteps, the distant bark of a dog, and the occasional chirp of early evening birds. Both girls were acutely aware of how they stood out in this neighborhood, where the houses looked like they belonged in magazines, and the lawns were maintained by professional services. The low rumble of an engine behind them made Maya's shoulders tense. She didn't turn around, but she could feel it, the crawl of a vehicle moving too slowly to be a regular resident heading home. The twins continued walking, their steps perfectly matched, trying to project an air of belonging. The patrol car's headlights cast their shadows far ahead of them, stretching and distorting their silhouettes on the pavement. Maya's hand instinctively tightened around her phone as the vehicle drew closer. The headlights flashed once, bright and demanding. Zuri's breathing quickened, but her face remained composed. She'd always been better at hiding her emotions than Maya. The patrol car's tires crunched against the curb as it pulled over beside them. Officer Dean Kavanaugh emerged from the vehicle with deliberate slowness, like a cat toying with its prey. His hand rested casually on his holster, a gesture that appeared relaxed but carried an implicit threat. The badge on his chest caught the fading sunlight, flashing like a warning signal. "Where you girls heading?" His voice dripped with false friendliness, the kind that barely masked contempt. His eyes moved between them, taking in their appearance, their clothes, their presence in this neighborhood where he clearly thought they didn't belong. Maya felt her heart hammering against her ribs, but she kept her voice steady. "Home." The word came out clear and firm, just as she'd practiced countless times with her father during his safety lectures. "Home?" Kavanaugh's eyebrow arched upward, his lips curling into a smirk. "In this neighborhood?" The question hung in the air like poison. From the corner of her eye, Maya saw Zuri slowly raising her phone, angling it just right to capture the interaction. Her sister's movements were subtle, practiced. They'd discussed this scenario too many times with their father to be unprepared. Kavanaugh's eyes narrowed as he noticed the phone in Zuri's hands. His fake smile disappeared, replaced by something harder, colder. The hand on his holster tightened. The crackle of a radio broke the tension, and another patrol car's lights appeared in the distance, racing toward them. Maya's stomach dropped. One officer they might have handled, might have been able to talk their way through. But two patrol cars meant this was about to become something else entirely. The second car pulled up behind them, boxing them in. Kavanaugh moved with sudden speed, crossing the distance between them in two long strides. His hand shot out, snatching Zuri's phone from her grip. His fingers moved quickly across the screen, deleting the evidence she'd managed to capture. "That's private property," Maya protested, her voice rising despite her best efforts to stay calm. "You can't—" "Hands behind your back," Kavanaugh cut her off, his voice now stripped of all pretense of friendliness. "Both of you." The second officer approached from behind, and Maya felt the cold bite of handcuffs against her wrists. Beside her, Zuri remained silent as she too was cuffed, but Maya could see the slight tremor in her sister's hands. Kavanaugh's smirk returned as he watched his partner secure the twins. "We'll sort this out at the station." He dangled Zuri's phone in front of them before pocketing it. "Wouldn't want any misunderstandings about what happened here." Maya and Zuri were led to Kavanaugh's patrol car, forced to duck their heads as they were pushed into the back seat. The door slammed behind them with a finality that made Maya's chest tighten. Through the window she could see their phones, their lifeline to their father sitting on the front passenger seat, maddeningly out of reach. The partition between the front and back seats stood like a wall between them and any hope of reasoning with Kavanaugh. Maya looked at her sister, seeing her own fear reflected in Zuri's usually stoic eyes. They'd done everything right, everything their father had taught them, and still ended up here, trapped in the back of a patrol car, heading toward a station where they knew anything could happen. The fluorescent lights of the police precinct buzzed overhead as Maya and Zuri were marched through the front doors at 8:15 p.m. The harsh lighting made everything look stark and clinical, casting harsh shadows across the worn linoleum floors. Maya's heart thundered in her chest, each beat a reminder of how quickly their evening walk had turned into a nightmare. Officer Kavanaugh guided them past the front desk, where a sergeant barely glanced up from his paperwork. The message was clear. They weren't worth noticing. Other officers moved around them like they were furniture, conversations continuing without pause, laughter echoing off the walls as if two handcuffed teenage girls were an everyday occurrence. "Have a seat," Kavanaugh said, gesturing to a row of hard plastic chairs against the wall. His tone was casual, almost bored, but his eyes gleamed with satisfaction. "Make yourselves comfortable. We've got plenty of time." Maya's legs felt weak as she sat down, the plastic chair cold through her jeans. Beside her, Zuri maintained her composed expression, but Maya could feel her sister trembling slightly where their shoulders touched. The handcuffs bit into their wrists, a constant reminder of their powerlessness. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Officers passed by, some smirking, others simply looking through them as if they were invisible. Maya watched the clock on the wall tick slowly forward, each minute dragging by with excruciating slowness. She thought about their father, probably still at work, unaware that his daughters were sitting handcuffed in a police station. Kavanaugh stayed nearby, leaning against a desk, occasionally making jokes with his colleagues while keeping one eye on the twins. He was playing with them, Maya realized, letting them stew in their fear and uncertainty. The fluorescent lights seemed to grow brighter and more oppressive with each passing minute. At last, Kavanaugh pushed himself away from the desk and approached them. "Time for processing," he announced, reaching for Maya's arm. "You first, princess." Maya felt her sister tense beside her as Kavanaugh pulled her to her feet. He led her down a narrow hallway, away from the main room and away from Zuri. The processing room was small, barely larger than a closet, with peeling paint on the walls and a cracked mirror hanging at eye level. "Stand there," Kavanaugh ordered, pointing to a spot in front of the mirror. His earlier false friendliness had vanished entirely, replaced by cold authority. "And when you address me, you say, sir?" Maya stared at his reflection in the mirror, her jaw set. She wouldn't give him that satisfaction. She wouldn't play his game. "I said," Kavanaugh's voice hardened, "you address me as a sir. Let's try again." Maya remained silent, her heart racing but her resolve firm. She watched his reflection darken with anger, saw the muscle in his jaw twitch. "You're being difficult," he said, reaching into his desk drawer. The sound of metal scraping against metal filled the small room. "I don't like difficult." Maya's breath caught in her throat as Kavanaugh pulled out a pair of scissors. The fluorescent light glinted off the metal blades as he approached her from behind. "Let's make things simple, sweetheart." His voice was almost gentle, which made it all the more terrifying. Before Maya could react, His hand seized a handful of her hair, pulling it taut. The scissors made a harsh snapping sound. Maya watched, horrified, as chunks of her hair fell to the floor like dead leaves. Kavanaugh didn't stop with one cut. He moved around her head, the scissors snapping again and again, leaving uneven patches and exposed scalp in their wake. "Bet you'll listen next time," Kavanaugh said, stepping back to admire his work. His reflection grinned at her in the cracked mirror. Maya stared at herself, unable to look away from the stranger in the reflection. Her beautiful hair, which she'd spent years growing out, lay in clumps around her feet. What remained on her head was a disaster of uneven lengths and bare patches. She felt numb, disconnected, as if she were watching this happen to someone else. The sound of Zuri's voice penetrated the fog in Maya's mind. Her sister was screaming somewhere outside the room, the sound muffled by the closed door, but still clear enough to hear the panic in her voice. Kavanaugh grabbed Maya's arm again, steering her toward the door. "Let's show your sister your new look," he said, his voice thick with amusement. When they emerged into the main area, Zuri's screams cut off abruptly. Her eyes widened in horror as she took in Maya's appearance. Several officers looked up from their desks, and the sound of chuckling filled the air. Kavanaugh released Maya's arm and walked back to his desk, leaning back in his chair with a satisfied smile as if admiring his handiwork. Other officers joined in his laughter, some shaking their heads, others making quiet comments Maya couldn't quite hear. She stood there, exposed and humiliated, while her sister struggled against the officer holding her back. "All right, that's enough entertainment for now," Kavanaugh announced, standing up. "Let's get them settled for the night." The twins were marched toward the holding cells, their footsteps echoing in the suddenly quiet hallway. The cell door squealed on its hinges as it opened, and they were roughly pushed inside. The sound of the lock clicking into place seemed to echo in Maya's ears. The cell was cold and smelled of disinfectant and despair. A single bench lined one wall, and a small window high up showed a slice of dark sky. The clock visible through the cell bars read 9 p.m. Only 45 minutes had passed since they'd entered the precinct, but Maya felt like she'd aged years in that time. Zuri reached out and touched what remained of Maya's hair, her fingers gentle, her eyes filling with tears. Maya couldn't bring herself to speak. She could still feel the ghost of Kavanaugh's hand in her hair, still hear the snap of the scissors, still see his grinning reflection in that cracked mirror. Meanwhile, FBI Chief James Carter sat in a dimly lit conference room in Washington, surrounded by stacks of files and empty coffee cups. The clock on the wall showed 9:30 p.m., and the meeting about recent domestic terrorism threats had dragged on longer than expected. His phone vibrated silently on the table, displaying his personal assistant's number. Carter excused himself and stepped into the hallway, his shoes clicking against the polished floor. "Sir." His assistant's voice was tense, controlled. "We found Maya and Zuri." Carter's hand tightened on the phone. The world seemed to slow down, each heartbeat echoing in his ears. "Where?" The single word carried the weight of every father's fear. "The 5th Precinct, sir. They've been there since around 8:15. Carter ended the call without another word. He returned to the conference room, gathered his belongings with deliberate calm, and informed his colleagues of a family emergency. No one questioned him. They knew better than to probe when Chief Carter made a decision. The drive to the precinct was a blur of streetlights and silent prayers. Carter's mind raced through scenarios, each worse than the last. His daughters knew the rules, knew how to stay safe. Something had gone very wrong. At 9:50 p.m., Carter's black SUV pulled into the precinct parking lot. He straightened his tie, adjusted his jacket, and walked through the front doors with measured steps. The buzz of conversation died as he entered. Officers who had been laughing moments before fell silent, their faces dropping as recognition set in. Officer Dean Kavanaugh sat at his desk, a coffee cup halfway to his lips. He froze when he saw Carter, but quickly recovered, setting the cup down with an attempted air of casualness. Other officers suddenly found reasons to be elsewhere, papers rustling as they made hasty exits. Carter didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His presence filled the room like a gathering storm. He walked to the front desk, his shoes echoing in the sudden silence. "My daughters," he said simply. The desk sergeant fumbled with his keys, nearly dropping them. "Right away, sir." Carter followed him to the holding cells, where Maya and Zuri sat huddled together on a metal bench. The sight of Maya's mutilated hair sent ice through his veins, but his expression remained unchanged. The cell door opened with a metallic clang. Maya and Zuri rushed to their father but stopped short of embracing him. They knew him well enough to recognize the dangerous calm in his demeanor. Carter touched Maya's shoulder gently, then Zuri's, before turning back to the main room. Dean Kavanaugh stood by his desk trying to project confidence he clearly didn't feel. Other officers watched from the edges of the room, their faces masks of careful neutrality. "The arrest reports," Carter said, his voice carrying easily in the silent room. Dean shifted his weight. "Sir, I haven't had time to—" "The body cam footage, then." A senior officer cleared his throat. "There seems to be a technical issue with the cameras from tonight's shift." Carter pulled out his phone, his movements unhurried. Dean's attempted smirk wavered as he watched Carter scroll through his contacts. "Your girls were resisting, sir," Dean said, injecting false authority into his voice. "I had to take appropriate action to—" Carter didn't acknowledge him. Instead, he pressed a number on his phone and held it to his ear. "Mayor Vaughn?" "James Carter. We need to discuss a situation at the 5th Precinct." He paused, listening. "Yes, it's urgent. No, it can't wait until morning." Dean's face paled slightly as Carter continued his conversation. Within minutes, phones throughout the precinct began ringing. The captain's office light flicked on, and Dean's superior hurried inside, looking distinctly worried. More calls were made. More lights came on in offices. Dean stood by his desk, his earlier arrogance cracking as he watched the activity around him increase. He didn't understand yet that he had set his own destruction in motion the moment he decided to harass 2 teenage girls walking home. Carter ended his call and tucked his phone away. Without a word, he gestured for Maya and Zuri to follow him. They walked past Dean, past the other officers, past the front desk where the sergeant now sat very still, avoiding eye contact. The night air felt clean after the stifling atmosphere of the precinct. Carter opened the SUV's back door for his daughters, then walked around to the driver's side. As he started the engine, he could see lights coming on in more offices inside the precinct. Phones continued to ring. Dean stood in the precinct doorway watching them leave. He still wore a hint of his earlier smirk, still believed in the system that had always protected him. He didn't realize that by morning that system would begin dismantling itself to save its own skin. Carter pulled away from the precinct, leaving behind a building buzzing with sudden activity. Mayor Vaughn would be making calls all night. Evidence would disappear. Stories would be crafted. By sunrise, the cover-up would begin, but not the one Dean Kavanaugh expected. In the rearview mirror, Carter could see his daughters holding hands in the back seat. Maya's ruined hair caught the streetlights as they drove, and Zuri's eyes met his in the mirror, filled with a mixture of trust and uncertainty. Carter kept driving, heading home, knowing that tomorrow would bring its own battles. The next day, the morning sun hadn't yet cleared the horizon when Officer Dean Kavanaugh strolled into the 5th Precinct. His uniform was crisp, his badge gleaming, and his steps carried the same swagger they always did. The night shift officers avoided his gaze as they gathered their belongings to leave, but Dean barely noticed. He was too busy replaying his victory from the previous night. A young officer intercepted him before he could reach his desk. "Captain wants to see you," she said quietly. "Conference room B. They said it's urgent." Dean's smile widened. Probably a commendation, he thought. Maybe even a promotion for handling those troublemakers so efficiently. He adjusted his collar and made his way to the conference room. The smile froze on his face when he opened the door. Captain Morrison sat at the head of the table, his expression unreadable. To his left was Sarah Jenkins, the city attorney, her hands folded neatly over a thick manila folder. On the right sat Lieutenant Rodriguez from Internal Affairs, tapping a pen against a legal pad covered in notes. "Close the door, Officer Kavanaugh," Captain Morrison said, his voice carefully neutral. Dean's hand trembled slightly as he pushed the door shut. The click of the latch seemed unusually loud in the silent room. He remained standing, suddenly unsure of protocol. "Sit down," Jenkins said, gesturing to the empty chair across from her. Her tone was professionally pleasant, but her eyes were sharp. Dean lowered himself into the chair, his starched uniform suddenly feeling too tight. "What's this about?" he asked, trying to maintain his usual confidence. Lieutenant Rodriguez spoke first, his pen still tapping. "We need to discuss last night's incident with the Carter sisters." "Everything's in my report," Dean said quickly. Too quickly. "What report?" Jenkins asked, raising an eyebrow. "There's nothing in the system." Before Dean could respond, Captain Morrison slid a fresh arrest report across the table. "Fill this out now. Be specific about the girl's aggressive behavior." Dean blinked. "Sir?" "Write that they were belligerent," Jenkins prompted. "That they refused to comply with simple commands. Make it clear they escalated the situation." Understanding dawned slowly. They were helping him craft the narrative. Dean's confidence began to return as he picked up the pen. He described how Maya and Zuri had been walking suspiciously, how they'd refused to answer questions, how they'd become confrontational when asked to provide identification. While he wrote, Jenkins pulled documents from her folder. "We've prepared supporting evidence, a complaint from the boutique on 5th Street about 2 girls matching their description attempting to shoplift, a witness statement from a resident about suspicious activity in the neighborhood. All properly backdated and entered into the system," Rodriguez added. Captain Morrison nodded approvingly. "The press already has their mugshots. Channel 8 is running a story about troubled teens and the importance of proper police response. You'll be painted as the officer who maintained control of a volatile situation." Dean's pen moved faster now, his earlier anxiety forgotten. The system was working exactly as it always had, protecting its own. He finished the report with a flourish, adding extra details about Maya's aggressive posturing and Zuri's threatening movements with her phone. "Perfect," Jenkins said, collecting the report. "This matches our prepared narrative exactly." Dean leaned back in his chair, his swagger returning. "Glad I could help set the record straight." The meeting continued for another hour, fine-tuning details and establishing the official timeline. Dean's responses became more relaxed, more assured. By the time they finished, his earlier concerns had completely evaporated. Back at his desk, Dean logged into his computer to check his email. The screen flickered once, then displayed an error message. He frowned and tried again. Nothing. "Hey, Thompson," he called to the IT guy passing by. "My email's not working." Thompson paused, looking uncomfortable. "Yeah, there's some kind of system issue. Can't seem to fix it." Dean shrugged and pulled out his phone to check his bank balance. His morning coffee would have to wait until after his shift anyway. The banking app loaded slowly, then showed a balance that made his heart skip. $2,000 was missing, and he dialed the bank immediately. After 20 minutes on hold, a representative informed him that there appeared to be a glitch in their system. They couldn't locate any records of his recent transactions. "Officer Kavanaugh?" A voice interrupted his increasingly heated phone conversation. It was Sandra from Records. "We have a problem with your patrol logs from last night. They're gone." Dean ended the call with the bank. "What do you mean gone?" "The GPS tracking data, the radio logs, everything. It's like you were never on duty." Sandra twisted her hands nervously. "I've never seen anything like it." A cold feeling began to spread through Dean's chest. He remembered FBI Chief Carter's calm demeanor the night before, the way he'd made those phone calls without raising his voice. But surely this was just a coincidence. Technical glitches happened all the time, right? Meanwhile, in a secure room at FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C., a junior analyst named Marcus Chen received a priority alert on his screen. A new case file had just been opened, classified at the highest level. He entered his security credentials and opened the file. The first page contained a single photograph and a name: Officer Dean Kavanaugh, 5th Precinct. Marcus scrolled through the preliminary data. Bank records, phone logs, GPS data, email archives. Everything about Kavanaugh's life was being quietly collected and analyzed. Notes from past incidents, civilian complaints that had disappeared, body cam footage that had conveniently malfunctioned. It was all there, meticulously documented. In the authorization section, Marcus saw a single name, FBI Chief James Carter. Carter himself hadn't appeared on any news broadcasts. He hadn't issued any statements or made any public complaints. To the outside world, he seemed to be going about his normal routine, attending meetings and handling his usual caseload. But in secure rooms and encrypted databases across multiple federal agencies, the machinery of justice had begun to move. Quiet phone calls were being made, records were being pulled, witnesses from past incidents were being contacted. The hunt had begun, and Dean Kavanaugh didn't even know he was the prey. The morning sun filtered through the living room curtains of the Carter household, casting long shadows across the plush carpet. Maya and Zuri sat side by side on the leather couch, their bodies rigid with tension as they watched the local news unfold on their large flat-screen TV. Their father stood behind them, his hands resting on the back of the couch, his expression unreadable. "Breaking news this morning," the anchor announced, her perfectly coiffed hair and practiced smile a stark contrast to the cruel story she was about to deliver. 2 local teenagers were arrested last night following a shoplifting incident in the upscale Riverside district. Maya's mugshot appeared on the screen, her eyes red from crying, her partially shaved head a testament to the previous night's humiliation. Beside it, Zuri's photo showed her looking straight at the camera, her face a mask of controlled anger. "No," Maya whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. "They didn't." The Carter sisters, both 17, were apprehended by Officer Dean Kavanaugh after receiving reports of suspicious activity in the area, the anchor continued. Sources say the teens became confrontational when questioned by police. Zuri's fingers dug into the couch cushions. "We never even went into any stores," she said through gritted teeth. "This is completely made up." Their father remained silent, but his grip on the couch tightened imperceptibly. The story continued to unfold, each word more devastating than the last. Security footage from nearby streets showed them walking, edited to make their casual stroll look furtive and suspicious. A witness claimed they'd been acting suspiciously around local businesses. The morning shows picked up the story within hours. On Wake Up America, a panel of experts dissected the incident with cruel efficiency. "Look, we're seeing this more and more," said a silver-haired commentator, his voice dripping with false concern. "Teenagers who think they're above the law, who believe their parents' status makes them untouchable. These girls clearly have an attitude problem," another pundit chimed in. "The officer's report states they were belligerent from the start. Where were their parents when they were learning how to interact with law enforcement?" Maya's phone buzzed constantly with notifications. The comment sections of local news websites were flooded with thinly veiled racist remarks. Typical entitled behavior. They always act like this when they get caught. Should have shown more respect to the officer. Zuri scrolled through Twitter, her face growing darker with each swipe. "They're calling us thugs," she said quietly. "They're saying we deserved it." The police union's statement appeared as a breaking news banner across the bottom of the screen. The 5th Precinct Police Union stands firmly behind Officer Kavanaugh's actions. The arrest was conducted according to standard protocol, and any claims to the contrary are unfounded. Across town in his modest apartment, Officer Dean Kavanaugh lounged on his worn leather recliner, a steaming cup of coffee in his hand. His TV was also tuned to the morning news, but his expression couldn't have been more different from the Carter family's. He smiled broadly as the story played out exactly as planned. His phone lit up with messages from fellow officers. "Way to handle those troublemakers, Dean. Shows them they can't mess with us. Even FBI Daddy can't help them now." Dean typed out a response. "Told you I'd be fine. System works like it always does." He took another sip of coffee, savoring both the bitter warmth and his apparent victory. The morning sun felt particularly sweet on his face as he watched social media explode with debate. Some users defended the twins. "These girls are straight A students. This doesn't add up. Where's the proof?" But others piled on with the official narrative. If they didn't do anything wrong, why were they arrested? Just because they're daddy's FBI doesn't mean they're angels. Dean was about to text another smug response to his colleagues when something on the TV caught his attention. The news had cut to a live segment outside Riverside Boutique, the store where the twins had allegedly attempted to shoplift. "We've obtained security footage from the evening in question," the reporter announced. According to the police report, the Carter sisters attempted to steal merchandise from this location at approximately 7:15 p.m. yesterday. The footage began to play. The timestamp clearly showed 7:15 p.m. Customers came and went, but there was no sign of Maya or Zuri. The footage continued rolling through 7:30 p.m., the entire time period when they were supposedly attempting to steal from the store. The reporter's voice took on a questioning tone. "We've reviewed all available security footage from yesterday evening. At no point do the Carter sisters appear to enter or even approach this establishment." Dean's coffee cup slipped from his fingers, spilling hot liquid across his lap. He barely noticed the burn. In the Carter living room, the atmosphere shifted. Maya and Zuri exchanged glances as their father pulled out his phone. He didn't speak, didn't show any emotion, but his fingers moved across the screen with purpose. The reporter continued. "This appears to contradict the official police statement regarding the reason for the initial stop. We've reached out to the 5th Precinct for comment on this discrepancy." More holes began to appear in real time. The boutique owner, speaking live on camera, looked confused when asked about the shoplifting complaint. "We didn't file any report yesterday," she said. "In fact, we had no incidents at all." Maya and Zuri watched their father as he made his call. His voice was calm, measured, almost gentle, but there was steel beneath the surface. "Yes," he said into the phone. "I think it's time we released the other footage." The early morning sun had barely risen when 3 FBI agents walked into the 5th Precinct's evidence room. They moved with quiet efficiency, their badges displayed, but their presence understated. No dramatic announcements, no flashy displays of authority, just the soft sound of their shoes on the linoleum floor and the gentle hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Agent Sarah Chen logged into the department's computer system using credentials that shouldn't have existed. Agent Marcus Rodriguez began methodically checking physical evidence boxes. Agent Thomas Weber stood watch, his presence casual but his eyes alert. "Starting with January," Chen murmured, her fingers flying across the keyboard, "focusing on Dean Kavanaugh's cases." Digital files began disappearing from the system, not deleted but transferred to secure FBI servers. Arrest records, body camera footage, complaint forms, all carefully extracted and preserved as evidence. The agents worked with practiced precision, leaving no trace of their activities. By midday, the evidence room had been quietly stripped of its secrets. The agents departed as silently as they had arrived, carrying hard drives and select physical evidence boxes. To anyone passing by, it looked like routine administrative work. Dean Kavanaugh sat at his desk later that afternoon, trying to pull up Maya and Zuri's arrest records. His computer showed an error message, "File not found." He frowned, double-checking the case number. Nothing. "Hey, Tommy," he called out to a nearby officer. "Can you access last night's arrests?" Officer Thompson tried his own computer. "System's working fine for me, just not those specific files." Dean's frown deepened as he opened another program to check his patrol car's GPS logs from the previous night. Another error message appeared. His stomach tightened as he reached for his phone to call the IT department. "IT, this is Mike," a tired voice answered. "Yeah, this is Officer Kavanaugh. I'm having trouble accessing some files from last night. Can you check if there was a system purge?" "No purges scheduled," Mike replied. "And we haven't received any deletion requests. Everything should be there." Dean's hand tightened around the phone. "Well, it's not. Can you restore them?" "There's nothing to restore, officer. According to our logs, those files never existed." Across town, in a small coffee shop far from the precinct, James Carter sat across from Officer Marcus Williams, a veteran cop from Dean's precinct. Williams stirred his coffee slowly, his eyes scanning the nearly empty cafe. "Thank you for meeting me," Carter said quietly. Williams nodded. "Been wanting to come forward for a while now. What happened to your girls? That was the last straw." "How deep does this go?" Carter asked, his voice level but his eyes intent. Williams let out a heavy sigh. "Deep," he replied, leaning forward. "And Dean's just the tip of it. We're talking years of covered-up misconduct, falsified reports, Evidence tampering. Dean's protected because he knows where all the bodies are buried. Carter took a slow sip of his coffee. Names? I've got a list, William said. Dates, incidents, witnesses. Been keeping track for 3 years now. Meanwhile, Dean's day was getting worse. His phone buzzed with a notification from his banking app. He opened it and froze. His account balance read $0, 0 cents. His hands shaking slightly, he dialed his bank's number. I'm showing your mortgage was purchased this morning by a private investment firm, the bank representative explained. All funds were legally transferred according to the terms of your loan agreement. What investment firm? Dean demanded. I'm sorry, sir, but that information is confidential. Dean pulled out his credit card to buy lunch. Declined. He tried another. Declined. His third card. Declined. Panic rising in his chest, Dean stormed through the precinct hallways toward his chief's office. He burst through the door without knocking, his face red with anger. I'm being set up, he yelled, slamming his hands down on the chief's desk. Chief Roberts looked up slowly, his expression guarded. Keep your voice down, Dean. My files are gone, my bank account is empty, my credit cards are frozen. Someone's coming after me. The chief leaned back in his chair, studying Dean with a mixture of concern and calculation. He knew something was happening. The morning's evidence room activity hadn't gone unnoticed, but the scope of it was still unclear. We'll figure this out, Roberts said carefully. Just keep your head down and... The small TV mounted in the corner of his office suddenly caught their attention. A breaking news banner scrolled across the screen. Federal investigation launched into Officer Dean Kavanaugh's arrest record, multiple cases under review. The color drained from Dean's face as the reporter continued. Sources say the FBI is examining a pattern of potentially falsified reports and civil rights violations spanning several years. Multiple witnesses have come forward. Dean stared at the screen, his mouth hanging open. Chief Roberts watched him with a growing realization that this was beyond his power to control. Dean, Roberts said quietly, I think you should call your union rep. But Dean barely heard him. He was too busy watching his carefully constructed world of impunity crumble around him. His phone buzzed again, another notification from his bank. His hands trembled as he read the message. Second mortgage payment due. Failure to pay will result in immediate foreclosure proceedings. The chief's phone started ringing, then Dean's phone, then the office line. News vans began pulling up outside the precinct windows. Dean Kavanaugh stood in the middle of his chief's office, watching his untouchable status vanish in real time. The morning sun that had felt so warm and reassuring just hours ago now seemed harsh and exposing, illuminating every dark corner he thought would stay hidden forever. Later, Dean's knuckles turned white as he gripped his steering wheel, driving to the police station on a route he'd taken thousands of times before. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air conditioning. His stomach churned, a foreign sensation for a man who'd always walked into work with the confidence of someone who knew the system would protect him. The familiar brick building loomed ahead, but today it felt different, threatening. As he pulled into his usual parking spot, he noticed Officer Martinez quickly averting his eyes and hurrying inside. Strange. Martinez usually stopped to chat about last night's game. Dean wiped his palms on his uniform pants before grabbing his bag. The walk from his car to the precinct entrance felt longer than usual. Through the glass doors, he could see people moving around, but something was off about their movements. Too deliberate, too careful. The usual morning buzz of the station fell silent as he entered. Officers who normally greeted him with friendly nods suddenly found their computer screens fascinating. Detective Rogers, who'd shared drinks with Dean just last weekend, became intensely focused on a manila folder. The desk sergeant pretended to be on an important phone call, though Dean could clearly see the phone wasn't lit up. "Morning," Dean called out, trying to sound casual. His voice echoed in the unnatural quiet. A few officers mumbled responses without looking up. Others simply pretended not to hear. He made his way to his desk, feeling eyes darting away as he passed. His chair squeaked as he sat down, the sound unusually loud in the stilted atmosphere. Opening his email, he found a new message marked, Urgent from the city council. His blood ran cold as he read the subject line. Emergency session results. Internal review of racial discrimination cases in law enforcement. The message contained a link to a live press conference. Dean clicked it with trembling fingers. Council President Maria Rodriguez stood at a podium, her expression grave. Following recent events and mounting evidence of systematic discrimination, the City Council has approved an immediate and comprehensive review of all racial discrimination complaints against our police force over the past 5 years. Of particular concern are cases involving Officer Dean Kavanaugh. Dean's name appeared on the screen behind her, along with a list of case numbers. His case numbers, cases he thought were buried forever. His phone buzzed. A text from another officer. They found the footage. Dean's heart stopped. The footage, the body cam recordings he'd been assured were erased. The ones showing. His computer pinged with another email. This one contained links to news articles, each one featuring a familiar face. Jamal Thompson, the teenager he'd arrested for jaywalking, when the kid was actually just standing on the sidewalk. Marcus Wilson, the honor student who'd resisted arrest in that dark alley behind the convenience store. And Timothy Robinson. Dean's mouth went dry. Timothy Robinson, the 15-year-old whose arrest report stated he'd been released without incident. The same Timothy Robinson whose mother had filed missing persons reports for months afterward. The stories were everywhere now. Local news websites, social media, national press picking up the pattern, victims coming forward, their testimonies backed by the suddenly recovered body cam footage. His phone rang. The caller ID showed his lawyer's number. "Dean," his lawyer's voice was tense. "Stop talking to the press. Now." "I haven't. Channel 7 just aired your comment about following procedure. That stops now. Don't speak to anyone. Not reporters, not other officers, not your own mother. You understand?" Before Dean could respond, another email appeared. This one from the mayor's office, a public statement distancing itself from the police union's defense of Dean's actions. Words like disturbing pattern and full cooperation with federal investigators jumped out from the screen. The chief's door opened. "Kavanaugh, my office." Dean stood on shaky legs, aware of the eyes following him across the room. The chief looked tired, his face lined with stress. "Sit down," he said, closing the door. Dean sat. The chief's desk was covered with papers, internal affairs reports, news clippings, printed emails. "The mayor's office is breathing down my neck," the chief said, rubbing his temples. "The feds are crawling all over our cases. The press is camped outside." He looked up at Dean. "You're on administrative leave, effective immediately." "Chief, you can't." "I can and I am. Turn in your badge and gun now." Dean's fingers trembled as he removed his badge. The metal felt cold against his palm as he placed it on the desk. His service weapon followed. "Get out of here," the chief said quietly. "And Dean? Get a good lawyer. You're going to need one." The walk back to his desk felt like a walk of shame. Everyone pretended to work, but he could feel their sideways glances. He grabbed his personal items, a coffee mug, a family photo, his spare phone charger, such ordinary things that suddenly felt wrong in his hands. The drive home was a blur of anger and fear. His mind raced with thoughts of revenge, of who might have talked, of how this could have happened to him. Him. The untouchable Officer Kavanaugh. His hands shook with rage as he turned onto his street. The familiar houses of his neighborhood offered no comfort today. As he approached his driveway, something caught his eye. A black SUV was parked across the street. Government plates, tinted windows so dark he couldn't see inside. It sat there, engine off, unmoving. Dean pulled into his driveway, trying to appear casual while his heart hammered in his chest. He glanced in his rearview mirror. The SUV hadn't moved. Its presence felt deliberate, watching, waiting. For the first time in his career, Dean understood what it felt like to be on the other side, to be the one being watched, to feel the weight of surveillance and know there was nothing you could do about it. He sat in his car, hands still gripping the wheel, staring at that black SUV in his mirror. The confidence that had carried him through years of unchecked power crumbled under the steady gaze of those tinted windows. Days later, the harsh banging on Dean's front door jolted him awake at 6 a.m. He lay there for a moment, heart racing, as the aggressive knocking continued. Through his bedroom window, the sky was still dark, with just a hint of dawn creeping over the horizon. The pounding grew more insistent. Dean stumbled out of bed, pulling on a wrinkled t-shirt over his sweatpants. His mouth felt dry, and his hands trembled slightly as he made his way down the hallway. Through the peephole, he saw two men in dark suits. Their faces were stern, professional. They held themselves with the unmistakable bearing of federal agents. Dean's stomach dropped. He opened the door, trying to project confidence he no longer felt. The taller agent spoke first, his voice crisp and emotionless. "Officer Dean Kavanaugh, FBI. We have some questions." Dean's throat tightened. "It's 6 a.m. "The timing is intentional," the second agent said. "Please come with us." They didn't flash badges. They didn't need to. The authority in their voices made it clear this wasn't a request. Dean looked down at his casual clothes. "Can I change first?" "No need," the first agent said. "This is informal." The word informal sent a chill down Dean's spine. He knew what that meant. No lawyers, no official record, no witnesses. Just him and whatever they had planned. The drive was silent. Dean sat in the back of their unmarked sedan, watching familiar streets pass by through tinted windows. They didn't head toward the federal building downtown. Instead, they pulled into an old office complex on the outskirts of the city. The agents led him through empty hallways to a small room. A single metal chair sat in the center, facing a plain table with two chairs on the opposite side. No windows, no cameras, no microphones visible. "Have a seat," the taller agent gestured to the lone chair. Dean sat, the metal cold through his thin clothes. The agents settled across from him, their movements unhurried, deliberate. The shorter agent placed a manila folder on the table but didn't open it. Minutes ticked by in silence. Dean could feel sweat forming on his forehead, but he didn't dare wipe it away. Finally, the taller agent slid the folder across the table. "Take a look," he said. Dean's hands weren't quite steady as he opened the folder. The first page was one of his arrest reports, but not quite. Small details were changed, dates altered, witness statements modified. His signature remained perfect at the bottom. The next page showed another report, this one about a routine traffic stop that had turned violent. Again, the details were subtly wrong, painting a different picture than what had actually happened. Then came the missing persons report. Timothy Robinson's face stared up at him from the photograph, young, bright-eyed, full of promise. The report listed Dean as the last person to see him alive. The agents watched him silently as he flipped through the pages. They didn't ask questions. They didn't make accusations. They simply observed as realization dawned on his face. Someone had been collecting evidence, piecing together a pattern he thought he'd buried. Across town, in the mayor's private office, James Carter sat across from Mayor Richard Vaughn. The morning sun cast long shadows through the window, but the atmosphere in the room was darker than any shadow. "You're about to lose your city," Carter said, his voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of steel. He placed a thick file on the mayor's desk. Vaughn's hands shook slightly as he opened it. Photographs spilled out. Teenage faces, all of them black or brown, all of them listed as missing after encounters with law enforcement. Police reports with inconsistencies highlighted in red. Bank records showing suspicious transfers. Email chains discussing cover-ups. "How ... Vaughn's voice trailed off. "Does it matter how?" Carter asked. "What matters is what happens next." The mayor slumped in his chair, suddenly looking older. He knew what this meant. If this evidence became public, it wouldn't just end careers. It would destroy his entire administration. Years of looking the other way, of protecting the wrong people, all coming back to haunt him. Meanwhile, at the precinct, Dean's world was unraveling thread by thread. His phone showed dozens of unanswered calls and texts to fellow officers, people who'd shared drinks with him, covered for him, sworn they had his back. Officer Martinez walked past him in the hallway without a word. Detective Rogers suddenly had meetings whenever Dean tried to talk to him. Even his partner of 3 years claimed to be too busy to meet for coffee. The police union held an emergency meeting that morning. Dean wasn't invited. He stood outside the conference room, watching through the window as people he'd known for years discussed his fate without him. His chief called him into the office just before noon. "Take a few weeks off," the chief said, not meeting his eyes. "Paid leave, until this blows over." Blows over? Dean's voice rose. "You know this is bull—" "That's an order, Kavanaugh. Go home." Dean stormed out of the station, rage burning in his chest. Officers scattered from his path, avoiding eye contact. The desk sergeant suddenly became very interested in his computer screen. The parking lot was empty except for his car. Dean fumbled with his keys, hands shaking with anger. As he looked up, something caught his eye. Across the street, a homeless man sat on a bench. His clothes were ragged, his beard unkempt, but something was off about him. He sat too straight, watched too intently. Dean found himself locked in the man's gaze. The stranger's lips curved into a smirk, not the vacant smile of someone living rough, but the knowing grin of someone with a secret. The rage in Dean's chest turned to ice. He recognized that look. He'd worn it himself too many times while watching suspects, waiting for them to make a mistake. Dean's hands trembled as he unlocked his car. He practically fell into the driver's seat, jamming the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and he pressed the accelerator hard, tires squealing as he pulled out of the parking lot. He drove fast, taking random turns, running yellow lights. His heart pounded in his chest as he checked his rearview mirror every few seconds. For the first time in his career, he understood what it felt like to be hunted, to be the one running, to be prey. Dean sat in his darkened living room, the TV's blue glow casting shadows on his unshaven face. An empty whiskey glass dangled from his fingers as the evening news droned on. Suddenly, the regular broadcast cut to breaking news, the bold red banner flashing across the screen. "We interrupt our regular programming with breaking news," the anchor's voice was grave. "Federal authorities have launched an investigation into disturbing allegations concerning missing black teenagers in our city. Sources say these disappearances may be linked to local law enforcement." Dean's glass slipped from his fingers, hitting the carpet with a dull thud. His throat went dry as the anchor continued. "According to preliminary reports, multiple teenagers have vanished after routine police encounters over the past 5 years. The FBI is now examining possible connections between these disappearances and specific officers within the department." They hadn't mentioned his name. Not yet. But Dean could feel the noose tightening. His hands shook as he reached for his phone, checking again for returned calls from his superiors. Nothing but silence. The news footage showed grieving mothers holding photographs of their missing children. Dean recognized some of those faces. Young faces. Faces he'd rather forget. Across town at FBI headquarters, James Carter stood before a wall of photographs and documents. His team of agents sat around a large conference table, each with identical folders before them. "It's time to start the leak," Carter said, his voice steady and cold. "Everything we have on the missing teenagers, arrest records, witness statements, timeline discrepancies. Send it all to these journalists." He slid a list across the table. An agent raised her hand. "Sir, what about the internal investigation?" "That continues parallel to this," Carter replied. "But the public needs to know. These families deserve answers." Within hours, select investigative journalists received anonymous packages. Inside, they found meticulously organized documents detailing years of suspicious patterns. Teenagers arrested for minor infractions, processed through booking, then vanishing without a trace. Sarah Chen, a veteran reporter at the city's largest newspaper, spread the documents across her desk. Her eyes narrowed as she noticed a pattern, one name appearing repeatedly in the arrest records: Officer Dean Kavanaugh. She began cross-referencing, creating a timeline. Each missing person case had similar elements: routine stops, minimal charges, Dean's signature on the paperwork. Then nothing. No court dates, no release records, just empty spaces where young lives should have continued. The police station was thick with tension. Officers clustered in small groups, speaking in whispers. Every time a phone rang, heads snapped up. Every time a door opened, conversations stopped. Officer Rodriguez found a note in his locker. Someone's talking. He crumpled it immediately, looking over his shoulder. The police union called an emergency meeting. The representative's voice was strained as he addressed the room. No one speaks to the media. No comments, no off-the-record conversations. Nothing. Direct all inquiries to the union's legal team. Dean sat in his car outside the station, repeatedly dialing numbers. His chief's phone went straight to voicemail. The captain wasn't taking calls. Even his old partner's number just rang and rang. His hands trembled as he scrolled through his contacts. Names that used to mean safety, protection, brotherhood. Now just a list of people avoiding him. The sun was setting when Dean finally gave up. He needed a drink. Not at home alone this time. He needed the noise, the distraction of a crowded bar. He chose O'Malley's, a dive bar far from his usual haunts. As he approached the entrance, a man in a crisp suit brushed past him. The contact was brief, but deliberate. A voice, barely above a whisper, reached his ears. Clock's ticking. Dean spun around, his heart racing. The street was empty. The man in the suit had vanished as if he'd never been there. The evening crowd moved around Dean as he stood frozen in the doorway, his stomach dropping to his feet. The words echoed in his head. Clock's ticking. Such a simple phrase, but it carried the weight of everything he'd tried to bury. Every report he'd falsified. Every teenager who'd disappeared. Every lie he'd told himself about doing what was necessary. Now, standing in the gathering darkness, Dean finally understood what it meant to be haunted. Not by ghosts, but by the very real specter of justice closing in. The clock wasn't just ticking. It was running out. The morning sun pierced through Dean's blinds like needles, each ray intensifying his pounding headache. Empty bottles littered his coffee table, evidence of another night trying to drink away his growing fears. His mouth felt like sandpaper and the room wouldn't stop spinning. He fumbled for the aspirin bottle, hands shaking as he struggled with the child-proof cap. The pills scattered across his kitchen counter, tiny white dots dancing before his bleary eyes. His phone buzzed against the granite countertop, the vibration seeming unnaturally loud in his fragile state. Unknown number. Dean squinted at the screen, his stomach churning from more than just the hangover. We need to talk, I know what you did. The words sent ice through his veins, instantly sobering him. Dean read the message 3 times, his breathing becoming shallow. His fingers hovered over the keypad, unsure whether to respond or delete the message. Another buzz. Remember Marcus Thompson? The warehouse? Dean's coffee mug slipped from his grip, shattering on the floor. Marcus Thompson. A name he hadn't heard in years. A name he'd tried to forget. With trembling hands, he dialed his contact at the phone company, one of the few people still taking his calls. I need a trace on a number. Now. 20 minutes later, he had a name. Michael Brooks. The connection clicked in Dean's mind. Brooks had been a detective in his precinct years ago. One of the good ones, people said. Until he started asking too many questions about certain arrests, certain missing persons cases. The department had made his life hell until he quit. Dean found himself driving to the industrial district, following coordinates Brooks had texted. The warehouse district loomed ahead, a maze of abandoned buildings and broken dreams. Perfect for meetings that needed to stay off the record. He parked his car behind a crumbling brick structure, rust-stained walls rising like ancient ruins around him. Brooks stood in the shadows of a loading dock, his dark skin almost invisible in the gloom. He'd aged since Dean last saw him, gray threading through his temples, lines etched deeper around his eyes. Didn't expect you to actually show, Brooks said, his voice carrying in the empty space. Dean tried to project his old authority, but his voice wavered. What do you want? To warn you. Brooks stepped forward, sunlight catching the silver in his hair. The FBI isn't just looking at you, Kavanaugh. They're building something bigger, Something that's going to bring down the whole house of cards. What are you talking about? Your precinct, the missing kids, the cover-ups, and it's all connected. Carter's team has been mapping it for months. Every dirty cop, every falsified report, every disappeared teenager. They're not just building a case against you, they're going after everyone involved. Dean's mouth went dry. You're lying. Am I? Brooks pulled out his phone, showed Dean a series of photographs. Remember this place? The images showed another warehouse, this one on the city's outskirts. Dean's heart stopped. He knew that building, had visited it many times over the years, always at night, always with a specific purpose. Cell tower data doesn't lie, Brooks continued. Your phone pinged near that location every time a kid went missing. Funny coincidence, isn't it? Meanwhile, across town, Carter stood in a high-tech operations room at FBI headquarters. Screens covered the walls, displaying surveillance photos, cell phone records, and GPS tracking data. At the center was a map with a single location highlighted, the warehouse. Sir, an agent called out, we've confirmed the pattern. Every victim's last known location traces back to this building before they vanished. Carter studied the evidence, his expression unchanged but his eyes burning with controlled fury. Show me Kavanaugh's movements. A new layer appeared on the map, red dots marking Dean's cell phone activity over the years. The warehouse appeared again and again, like a bloody wound on the city's landscape. What about security cameras? Carter asked. Mostly disabled or malfunctioning during the relevant times, another agent reported. But we found something interesting. Traffic cameras on approaching streets show Kavanaugh's patrol car entering the area multiple times, usually between 2 and 4 a.m. Carter nodded slowly. Get me everything on that building, property records, utility bills, maintenance logs. If anyone so much as changed a light bulb in there, I want to know about it. Back at the meeting, Dean's mind raced as Brooks laid out more details. The investigation wasn't just about missing teenagers anymore. It was about systemic corruption, about years of abuse hidden behind badges and bureaucracy. They're closing in, Brooks said. Carter's not going to stop until he exposes everything. And trust me, he knows about the warehouse. Dean's hands clenched into fists. Why are you telling me this? Because someone needs to know what's coming. The whole system's about to burn, and you're just the match that lit the fire. The meeting ended abruptly when Brooks's phone buzzed. He checked it, then melted back into the shadows without another word, leaving Dean alone with his growing terror. The drive home felt different. Dean kept checking his rearview mirror, paranoia creeping in with each turn. That's when he noticed it. A dark sedan, 3 cars back. It maintained perfect distance, never too close, never too far. He took a right turn, the sedan followed, he made a left at the next light. Still there. He circled the block. The car stayed with him. His heart hammered against his ribs. He'd been on the other side of this game countless times, the hunter tracking his prey. Now, for the first time, he knew what it felt like to be hunted. The sedan's windows were tinted black, hiding its occupants. But Dean didn't need to see them to know who they were. FBI, Carter's people, professional hunters who wouldn't lose their target. His hands gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. Every traffic light seemed to last an eternity. Every intersection held the possibility of more surveillance cars joining the tail. The familiar streets of his city had become a trap, and he was the animal caught in it. The sedan maintained its distance, a dark shadow in his mirror, a constant reminder that his world was shrinking, that his time was running out, that everything he'd done in that warehouse, every secret he'd buried was about to come to light. Dean burst through the police chief's office door without knocking, his face flushed and sweating. Papers scattered from the chief's desk from the force of his entrance. The chief looked up slowly, his expression carved from stone. "They're coming for us," Dean gasped, his usual swagger replaced by barely controlled panic. "We need to shut this down. Now." The chief leaned back in his leather chair, regarding Dean with cold eyes that held none of their former camaraderie. The silence stretched between them like a razor wire. "There is no we anymore," the chief said finally, his voice flat and dismissive. Dean's mouth opened and closed, struggling to process the betrayal. "What are you talking about?" We've always handled things together. The department, the chief cut in, is distancing itself from officers who abuse their position. He shuffled some papers on his desk, not meeting Dean's desperate gaze. You're on your own. The words hit Dean like physical blows. He gripped the back of a chair to steady himself, his knuckles white. You can't do this. We all knew what was happening. Everyone was involved. Were we? The chief's voice carried a dangerous edge. Because our records show a pattern of solo activity, unauthorized arrests, suspicious gaps in body cam footage, all tied to one officer. Dean's world tilted sideways as understanding dawned. They were hanging him out to dry, making him the scapegoat for years of systemic corruption. Over the next few days, the isolation became complete. His phone calls went straight to voicemail. Former drinking buddies crossed the street to avoid him. The precinct's break room fell silent whenever he entered. His union representative, who had backed him through countless complaints, sent a terse email. Find other representation. The final blow came when the police union issued their statement to the press. Dean watched it on his TV, a half-empty whiskey bottle clutched in his trembling hand. The police officers' union condemns in the strongest possible terms any abuse of power by law enforcement, the union president declared, his face stern with rehearsed outrage. The actions of a few bad actors do not represent the dedicated men and women who serve with honor. Dean hurled his glass at the screen, but the damage was already done. His former brothers in blue had abandoned him. His attempts to access his money met digital brick walls. Account frozen. Credit cards declined. Even his pension seemed to have vanished into bureaucratic limbo. Journalists camped outside his house like vultures, their cameras flashing whenever he appeared. Their questions followed him everywhere. Officer Kavanaugh, what happened to Marcus Thompson? Can you comment on the missing teenagers? Were there others involved in the cover-up? At FBI headquarters, Carter sat in his office, surrounded by the evidence of months of careful investigation, photos of the warehouse, cell phone records, witness statements from officers who had finally broken their silence. He picked up his phone and made a single call. Drop the report. The effect was immediate and devastating. Every major news outlet received copies of the federal investigation's findings. The report was comprehensive, detailing years of systematic abuse and cover-ups. It named names, provided dates, listed victims, and at the center of it all, Officer Dean Kavanaugh. The report revealed the full scope of his crimes. Teenagers arrested without cause, evidence planted, records altered or destroyed, and most damning of all, the pattern of disappearances linked to that warehouse on the city's outskirts. Dean watched his life unravel on every channel, in every newspaper, across every social media platform. His face appeared next to headlines about corruption and missing children. His name became synonymous with police brutality. He sat alone in his house, all the lights off except for the blue glow of his TV. The gun felt heavy in his hands, the same weapon he'd used to intimidate countless innocent people. Now it was his only companion. The journalists outside had multiplied, their cameras creating a strobe effect through his windows. His phone buzzed constantly with calls from reporters, lawyers, and federal agents. Dean's hands shook as he checked that his gun was loaded. For the first time in his career, real fear gripped him. Not the manufactured concern he'd claimed in official reports, but genuine terror. He wasn't just losing his job or his reputation. He was about to lose his freedom. The sound of splintering wood shattered the silence as his front door burst open. The red and blue lights from police vehicles painted Dean's suburban street like a twisted carnival. Neighbors peered through curtains as FBI agents swarmed his property, their black tactical gear a stark contrast against the manicured lawns and pristine facades. Dean had barely registered the sound of his front door being breached before they were on him. His gun clattered to the floor, kicked away by a swift boot. Strong hands grabbed his arms, forcing them behind his back as cold metal handcuffs bit into his wrists. Dean Kavanaugh, an agent's voice boomed, "You're under arrest." The man who had terrorized so many others now stumbled forward, his legs weak beneath him. Gone was the swagger, the arrogant smirk, the casual cruelty. His face was ashen, his expensive shirt wrinkled and stained with sweat. Cameras flashed like lightning as the agents marched him through his front door. The journalists who had been camping outside surged forward, shouting questions that blurred together in a cacophony of accusations. "Officer Kavanaugh, what happened to those missing teenagers? Did the department help cover up your crimes? How many others were involved?" Dean kept his head down, but he couldn't escape the cameras. Every major news outlet was there, documenting his fall from power. The same media that had once parroted his false narratives about Maya and Zuri now captured his shame in high definition. An agent guided his head down as they approached a black SUV with tinted windows. The vehicle that had watched him for weeks was now his transport to judgment. The door opened, and Dean was pushed inside, the plush leather seats feeling nothing like the hard plastic of his patrol car, where he'd detained so many innocent people. At FBI headquarters, the interrogation room was deliberately stark. A metal table, 2 chairs, and a large mirror that Dean knew concealed observers. His handcuffs clinked against the table as he shifted, trying to project confidence he no longer felt. "You don't have enough on me," Dean declared, his voice echoing in the small space. He'd been in rooms like this before, but always on the other side of the table. "This is all circumstantial. You've got nothing concrete." Carter entered the room silently, his presence filling the space like smoke. He carried a thick manila folder but didn't sit down. Instead, he stood, looking down at Dean with eyes that held no anger, no satisfaction, just cold, methodical purpose. Without a word, Carter slid the folder across the table. The sound of it scraping against metal seemed to stretch for an eternity. Dean's hands shook slightly as he opened it. His eyes widened as he flipped through page after page of evidence. There was the body cam footage he thought had been erased, crystal clear images of his abuse of power, written testimonies from fellow officers who had finally broken their silence, surveillance photos from the warehouse where teenagers had disappeared, phone records, bank statements, GPS logs. Every detail of his corruption laid bare in clinical, irrefutable detail. Dean started laughing, a hollow, desperate sound that bounced off the concrete walls. "This is some kind of joke, right? You doctored these. You can't—" His laughter died as Carter silently placed a USB drive on the table. Dean recognized it instantly, the one containing Zuri's original recording from the night he'd arrested them. The recording he thought he'd deleted. The panic hit him like a physical wave. His breath came in short gasps as he realized the depth of his situation. Every safeguard he'd counted on had crumbled. Every ally had abandoned him. Every crime he'd committed had been documented and preserved. Meanwhile, across town in the Carter household, Maya and Zuri sat on their living room couch, watching the news unfold. Maya's hair was growing back unevenly from where Dean had cut it, a visible reminder of his cruelty. But now, as they watched him being led away in handcuffs, that symbol of violation began to feel more like a badge of survival. Breaking news: FBI arrests Officer Dean Kavanaugh on multiple charges. The headline blazed across the screen. The sisters watched in silence as footage showed their tormentor being escorted into FBI headquarters. "The system that protected him," Zuri said quietly, her hand finding her sister's. "It's actually falling apart." Maya squeezed her twin's hand, tears in her eyes but her voice steady. "They tried to break us. Instead, they broke themselves." The news anchor's voice continued. "Sources say this arrest is part of a larger federal investigation into systemic corruption within the police department. Multiple officers are expected to be questioned in the coming days." Outside the FBI headquarters, reporters gathered around Carter as he emerged from the building. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the steps as cameras and microphones thrust toward him. "Chief Carter," a reporter called out, "what do you have to say about Dean Kavanaugh's arrest?" Carter turned to face the cameras directly, his expression resolute. Every word was measured, deliberate. "This is just the beginning." The courtroom's polished oak benches creaked under the weight of spectators as Dean Kavanaugh sat at the defense table, his wrists bound in steel handcuffs that caught the fluorescent lighting. His once pristine uniform had been replaced by a navy suit that seemed to hang loosely on his frame, as if his body was shrinking under the weight of justice. Across the aisle, James Carter guided his daughters to their seats in the front row. Maya's hair had grown out unevenly, the jagged edges a visible testament to Dean's cruelty. Zuri sat beside her, her hand never leaving her sister's, their matching expressions carved from determination rather than fear. The bailiff's voice cut through the murmuring crowd. "All rise!" The Honorable Judge Patricia Martinez presiding. The judge, a woman with steel-gray hair and eyes that had seen through countless lies, took her seat at the bench. The sound of her gavel echoed through the hushed courtroom like a thunderclap. In the case of the United States versus Dean Kavanaugh, we will now begin proceedings, Judge Martinez announced, her voice carrying authority that made even the most hardened officers in attendance sit straighter. The prosecutor, Sarah Chen, rose from her seat, her red blazer a splash of color against the courtroom's muted tones. Her heels clicked against the floor as she approached the jury box, each step measured and purposeful. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Chen began, her voice clear and unwavering, "the charges before you today paint a picture of corruption so deep, so systemic, that it will shake your faith in those sworn to protect us." She paused, letting her words settle. Kidnapping, tampering with evidence, fraud, conspiracy, assault. These aren't just words on a page. They represent real victims, real lives destroyed by the defendant's actions. Dean's defense attorney, Mark Reynolds, a man whose expensive suit couldn't hide his nervous energy, jumped to his feet. "Your Honor, my client is being made a scapegoat for departmental issues that go far beyond any one officer's actions. The prosecution is attempting to lay the blame for systemic problems at the feet of a dedicated public servant." Judge Martinez's eyes narrowed. "Your objection is noted, counsel. Continue, Ms. Chen." The prosecutor nodded, turning to face the large screen that had been set up. "The evidence will speak for itself." The courtroom lights dimmed and the video began to play. The footage, crystal clear despite Dean's attempts to destroy it, showed Maya in the processing room. The sound of scissors snipping through her hair filled the silence, punctuated by Dean's laughter and the muffled sobs of a teenage girl being stripped of her dignity. Maya gripped her sister's hand tighter, her knuckles white. In the gallery, several jurors wiped away tears. One older woman on the jury covered her mouth, her eyes fixed on the screen in horror. The video continued, showing other officers walking past the room, seeing what was happening and doing nothing. Their inaction was as damning as Dean's actions. When the lights came back up, Chen called her first witness. Officer Marcus Thompson, the whistleblower who had first approached Carter, took the stand. His police uniform seemed to weigh heavily on his shoulders as he raised his right hand to take the oath. "Officer Thompson," Chen began, "can you tell us about the culture within the department under Officer Kavanaugh's influence?" Thompson's voice was steady but thick with emotion. It was understood that certain officers could do whatever they wanted, especially to black suspects. Dean, Officer Kavanaugh, he was the worst of them. He called it maintaining order. But it was just abuse of power. As Thompson continued his testimony, detailing years of covered-up incidents and systematic harassment, Dean's composed facade began to crack. His jaw clenched, his fingers drumming against the table in an irregular rhythm. Behind the scenes, in a small room adjacent to the courtroom, Carter met with his final witness. Michael Brooks, a former officer who had been part of the missing teens operation, sat nervously adjusting his tie. He had agreed to testify in exchange for a reduced sentence, and the weight of what he was about to reveal showed in the sweat beading on his forehead. When Brooks took the stand, the courtroom fell completely silent. Dean's face drained of color as he recognized his former colleague. "Mr. Brooks," Chen said, "please tell the court about the warehouse on the outskirts of the city." Brooks swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper as he began. "It was a processing center. We'd bring in teenagers, always black, always from neighborhoods where people wouldn't ask too many questions. Dean would handle the paperwork, make them disappear from the system." "And what happened to these teenagers?" Chen pressed. "They were..." Brooks paused, his hands shaking. "They were sold. There was a whole network. Dean wasn't just taking bribes to look the other way. He was actively participating in human trafficking." The courtroom erupted in gasps and murmurs. Judge Martinez's gavel cracked through the air, restoring order, but the damage was done. Several jurors were openly glaring at Dean now, their faces twisted with disgust. Dean's grip on the table tightened, his knuckles white against the dark wood. Sweat began to soak through his expensive suit, creating dark patches under his arms and across his back. His eyes darted between his lawyer, the jury, and the exit like a trapped animal searching for escape. The evidence continued to mount. Financial records showed mysterious deposits to offshore accounts. Surveillance photos placed Dean at the warehouse multiple times. Phone records revealed connections to known trafficking rings. His defense team's arguments about being a scapegoat crumbled in the face of overwhelming evidence. Each piece of testimony, each document, each video clip tightened the noose around his neck. As Brooks detailed the extent of the trafficking operation, naming dates, locations, and victims, Dean's breathing became shallow and rapid. His lawyer placed a hand on his arm, trying to keep him calm, but Dean shrugged it off. The man who had once strutted through his precinct like a king now sat slumped in his chair, watching his empire of corruption crumble around him. The realization hit him like a physical blow. There would be no escape this time. No department cover-up. No convenient disappearance of evidence. For the first time since his arrest, Dean Kavanaugh truly understood that he was going to lose. Dean sat on the thin mattress of his holding cell, his orange jumpsuit a stark contrast to the power he once wielded in his police uniform. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across his face as his lawyer, Mark Reynolds, stood on the other side of the bars. "You have one option left," Reynolds said, his voice low and serious. He clutched his leather briefcase tightly, knuckles white against the handle. "The evidence against you is overwhelming. The jury's faces during the testimony, and I've never seen such unified disgust." Dean ran his hands over his face, the stubble rough against his palms. The cell felt smaller with each passing hour, the walls seeming to close in like a trap. "What option?" "They've got everything. That rat Brooks sold me out." "Exactly." Reynolds leaned closer to the bars, lowering his voice further. "Which is why we need to consider what you know. Who else was involved? Names, dates, locations, everything." Dean's eyes narrowed as he understood what his lawyer was suggesting. He stood up, pacing the small space like a caged animal. The concrete floor was cold through his thin prison shoes, each step echoing in the confined space. "You want me to talk?" Dean's laugh was hollow, bitter. "You want me to name names?" "It's your only play," Reynolds insisted. "The trafficking operation wasn't just you. There were judges involved, politicians, high-ranking officials, the kind of people who could make deals happen." Dean stopped pacing, his mind racing through years of corrupt dealings, secret meetings, and covered-up crimes. He thought of the powerful people who had patted him on the back, who had assured him he was untouchable. The same people who now wouldn't take his calls. Within hours, Dean sat across from 2 FBI agents in an interrogation room. The irony of his position wasn't lost on him. How many times had he been on the other side of this table? "I can give you everyone," Dean said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Judges who signed off on false warrants, politicians who took bribes to look the other way, police commissioners who helped cover up the missing teens." The agents exchanged glances. The older one, Agent Martinez, leaned forward. "We're not interested in deals, Mr. Kavanaugh. We already have most of those names from Officer Brooks and our other sources. What you're offering isn't worth anything." Dean felt the last thread of hope snap. "You don't understand. I know things Brooks doesn't. I can dash." "We understand perfectly," the younger agent cut him off. "You're trying to save yourself. But this isn't like before, when you could manipulate the system. This time, you're going to face the consequences of your actions." Outside the courthouse, the streets were filled with noise and tension. A pro-police rally had gathered, their blue flags waving in the air. Signs reading "Support our officers" and "Stop the witch hunt" bobbed above the crowd. "Dean Kavanaugh is a good cop," one protester shouted into a megaphone. "He's being sacrificed for political correctness." But then, from around the corner, another group appeared. They moved slowly, deliberately, their presence commanding attention. These were the survivors, people who had encountered Dean's brutality firsthand. Parents of missing teens carried large photographs of their children. Brothers, sisters, Friends of those who had disappeared held candles and walked in silence. The contrast was stark. The pro-police rally's angry shouts seemed to fade as the survivors' quiet dignity took center stage. News cameras swung away from the blue flags to focus on the faces in the photographs. Young, innocent faces of teenagers who had vanished after encounters with Dean Kavanaugh. A mother stepped forward, her voice breaking as she spoke to reporters. "My son was 16 when Officer Kavanaugh arrested him for jaywalking. That was the last time I saw him. The department told me he was released, but he never came home." More stories emerged. A father described how his daughter had been arrested for a minor traffic violation, only to disappear into the system. A brother talked about watching Dean beat his sister during an arrest, then finding out she had been processed at the warehouse. The public's reaction was immediate and visceral. Social media exploded with the survivors' stories. News channels ran side-by-side comparisons of Dean's arrest records and missing persons reports, showing the pattern that had been ignored for so long. In his cell, Dean watched it all unfold on the small television mounted in the corner. His face grew paler with each new testimony, each revealed connection. The pro-police protesters began to disperse, their certainty shaken by the overwhelming evidence of his crimes. His phone privileges had been restricted, but it didn't matter. No one was taking his calls anyway. The police union had publicly distanced itself from him. His former colleagues pretended they had never known him. The politicians and judges he had protected for years had gone silent. Dean's final court appearance for his bail hearing felt like a formality. His lawyer made weak arguments about community ties and flight risk, but his heart wasn't in it. Everyone in the courtroom knew what was coming. Judge Martinez looked down from her bench, her expression stern. "Mr. Kavanaugh, given the severity of the charges against you and the overwhelming evidence of your involvement in human trafficking, this court cannot in good conscience grant bail. Furthermore, due to the nature of your former position and the potential for interference with witnesses, I am ordering you to be held in maximum security until your trial." The words hit Dean like physical blows. Maximum security, the place where he had sent so many others, assuring them with a smirk that they deserved it. Now he would be the one in a cage, surrounded by concrete and steel, stripped of the power he had wielded so carelessly. As the guards led him away, Dean caught a glimpse of Maya and Zuri Carter sitting in the gallery. They weren't smirking or celebrating. They simply watched, their presence a reminder that justice, though slow, had finally caught up to him. The heavy doors of the maximum security wing closed behind him with a definitive clang. Dean's footsteps echoed in the corridor as the guards led him to his cell. For the first time, he truly understood what it meant to be trapped, to be at the mercy of a system he had once manipulated for his own benefit. The cell door slammed shut, the sound reverberating through the concrete walls. Dean stood in the small space, feeling the weight of confinement press in on him from all sides. He was caged, just like all those he had tormented, with nowhere left to run and no one left to protect him. Sometime later, the courtroom hummed with tension as the jury filed back in. Only 5 hours of deliberation. It had to mean something. The gallery held its breath, a collective pause that made the air feel thick and heavy. Dean sat rigid at the defense table, his suit hanging loose on his frame after weeks in custody. His face remained carefully blank, but his fingers twitched against the polished wood surface. He didn't blink, didn't move, as if staying perfectly still might somehow change what was coming. Maya and Zuri sat in the front row behind the prosecution, their father between them like a shield. Maya's hair had grown back unevenly, the shorter patches a constant reminder of that night at the station. But today she wore it proudly, each uneven strand a testament to what she had endured and overcome. The judge's voice cut through the silence. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The foreman stood, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes that had hardened during the trial. She held a piece of paper that would determine Dean's fate. "We have, Your Honor." The clerk approached, taking the paper to the judge. After reviewing it, the judge nodded and returned it. The foreman's voice was clear and strong as she began to read. "In the matter of the state versus Dean Kavanaugh, on the count of kidnapping in the first degree, we find the defendant." She paused, her eyes lifting to meet Dean's. Guilty. A ripple went through the courtroom. Dean's shoulder twitched, but he maintained his statue-like pose. On the count of criminal fraud, we find the defendant guilty. The foreman's voice grew stronger with each charge, as if each guilty was easier to say than the last. On the count of tampering with evidence, we find the defendant guilty. Dean's lawyer placed a hand on his arm, but Dean shrugged it off. His face had begun to lose its color, the reality of his situation finally breaking through his carefully maintained facade. On the count of conspiracy to commit human trafficking, we find the defendant guilty. The gallery remained silent, but the air crackled with emotion. In the back, several mothers of missing teens held each other, tears streaming down their faces. On the count of assault in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty. The final guilty echoed through the courtroom. Dean's face had turned ashen, his previous bravado completely stripped away. His hands gripped the table so hard his knuckles turned white. The judge thanked the jury for their service before turning to Dean. Her voice carried the weight of justice as she spoke. Dean Kavanaugh, you stand convicted of crimes that represent the gravest abuse of power and trust. You used your badge not to protect and serve, but to terrorize and destroy. You preyed upon the vulnerable, participated in the trafficking of minors, and corrupted the very system you swore to uphold. Dean stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched tight. The evidence presented in this court has shown a pattern of behavior so egregious, so fundamentally opposed to the principles of justice, that this court has no choice but to impose the maximum sentence allowed by law. The judge paused, her gaze boring into Dean. I hereby sentence you to life in prison without the possibility of parole. You will serve your sentence in a maximum security facility, where you will have ample time to reflect on the lives you have destroyed and the trust you have betrayed. Inside the FBI headquarters, Carter watched the proceedings on a secure feed. His face remained impassive, but his eyes held a quiet satisfaction. On his desk lay files, dozens of them, each containing names of other officers, judges, and politicians who had been part of Dean's network. The conviction was just the beginning, a single thread pulled loose from a tapestry of corruption. His phone buzzed with messages from his team. They were already moving on the next phase, preparing to bring down the others who had enabled Dean's crimes. The trafficking ring hadn't operated in isolation. It had required protection from above, silence from those who knew better, active participation from those who should have stopped it. Back in the courtroom, Dean stood as the bailiffs approached. The handcuffs clicked around his wrists, the sound final and decisive. As they began to lead him away, he turned his head, his eyes searching the gallery until they locked with Maya's. Maya met his gaze steadily. The fear was gone from her eyes, replaced by something stronger. She smiled, not a smile of mockery or revenge, but one of victory. She had faced his cruelty and emerged stronger. She had stood up to his power and watched it crumble. She had spoken her truth, and justice had listened. Dean's face twisted as he saw her smile. The bailiffs pulled him toward the side door, his feet dragging slightly on the polished floor. The man who had once strutted through the police station like a king was now being led away like any other criminal, powerless, defeated, and alone. Maya's smile didn't fade as she watched him disappear through the door. She had won, not just for herself and Zuri, but for all the others who had suffered at his hands, the missing teens whose faces had haunted the trial, the families who had waited years for answers, the community that had lived in fear of his badge and his power. The heavy door closed behind Dean with a final thud, and the courtroom began to stir with movement and quiet conversation. But Maya remained seated for a moment longer, feeling the weight of the moment. Her father's hand found her shoulder, a gentle squeeze conveying everything words couldn't say. Justice had prevailed. The system that Dean had manipulated for so long had finally turned against him. The power he had abused had been stripped away, leaving him to face the consequences of his actions. And Maya, the girl he had tried to break, sat free and strong, watching him being led away to spend the rest of his life behind bars. Hours later, the prison transport bus rumbled to a stop inside the high concrete walls of the maximum security facility. Dean sat near the back, his wrists and ankles bound in heavy chains that clinked with every movement. The orange jumpsuit felt rough against his skin. a far cry from his crisp police uniforms. Through the dusty windows, he could see guards stationed along the perimeter, their faces impassive. None of them showed any sign of recognition or sympathy. To them, he was just another number, another body to process through the system. The driver cut the engine and a guard stepped onto the bus. Everyone up. Single file. His voice was flat, mechanical, treating Dean no differently than the other new arrivals. Dean struggled to his feet, the chains restricting his movement. He had to shuffle awkwardly down the aisle, the same way he had made countless others do during his arrests. The irony wasn't lost on him, but he tried to maintain what was left of his dignity. Stepping off the bus, the summer heat hit him like a wall. The concrete yard stretched out before him, surrounded by towering walls topped with razor wire. Groups of inmates exercised in designated areas, their conversations dying down as they noticed the new arrivals. The processing was methodical and impersonal. Strip search, delousing shower, prison uniform, paperwork. The guards handled him with detached efficiency, no acknowledgement of his former status. When he tried to make eye contact with one of them, the guard looked right through him. "Cell block D," the processing officer announced, checking his clipboard. "Move it." As Dean walked through the prison corridors flanked by guards, he began to notice the stairs. Inmates pressed against cell bars, their eyes following his progress. Some faces showed recognition, others showed something darker. In the common area of cell block D, the atmosphere shifted immediately. Black inmates stopped their activities, their gazes hard and knowing. Some smiled, not friendly smiles, but the kind that promised something was coming. Others just watched, their silence more threatening than any words could be. A group of white inmates gathered in one corner took notice. They were covered in racist tattoos, their heads shaved, their postures aggressive. One of them nodded at Dean, expecting him to acknowledge the invitation to join their ranks. Dean had seen their type before. He'd even protected some of them on the outside. But now, he hesitated. That hesitation cost him. "What's wrong, officer?" a voice called out from behind him. "No badge to hide behind now?" Dean turned to face a tall black inmate who stood with his arms crossed. The man's face bore a scar, one that Dean suddenly remembered giving him during an arrest years ago. "I'm not looking for trouble," Dean said, trying to sound firm but neutral. The man laughed, the sound echoing off the concrete walls. "Funny. That's what I said that night. Remember?" Other inmates began to gather around, forming a loose circle. The guards at the periphery of the room made no move to intervene. They simply watched, their expressions unchanged. Dean's old instincts kicked in. He squared his shoulders, tried to project the authority he once wielded so easily. "Back off," he commanded. Nobody moved. Nobody listened. His words carried no weight here. The first punch caught him in the jaw, sending him stumbling backward. Dean tried to fight back, but years of relying on his badge and backup had made him soft. More fists followed. He went down hard on the concrete floor. Through the pain and confusion, Dean could hear laughter, not just from his attackers, but from the white supremacists who had expected him to join them. He had failed to choose a side, and now he had none. The beating didn't last long. The guards finally stepped in, but only after Dean had been thoroughly humbled. They dragged him to his feet, his face bloodied, his ribs aching. "Medical wing," one guard said flatly. "Then back to your cell." Meanwhile, across the city, James Carter sat in his office at FBI headquarters, surrounded by evidence boards and computer screens. Photos and documents covered every surface, connecting Dean to a larger network of corruption that stretched through law enforcement, the courts, and local government. Carter's team had been working around the clock, following money trails, intercepting communications, and turning small-time players into witnesses. Dean's conviction had been just the first domino to fall. "Sir," an agent appeared in his doorway. "The warrants just came through. We're ready to move on the judges." Carter nodded, his expression unchanged. "How many?" "5. All connected to the trafficking cases. We have proof they were paid to bury evidence, dismiss cases, seal records." "And the commissioners?" "3 of them. Plus the deputy mayor and 4 senior officers from Dean's precinct." Carter stood up, straightening his tie. Make the calls. I want them all in custody by morning. Back in the prison, night had fallen. Dean lay on his narrow bunk, every breath sending sharp pains through his bruised ribs. The cell was tiny, barely 6 steps from wall to wall. The concrete walls seemed to close in around him, and the darkness felt thick and oppressive. From somewhere down the cell block, he could hear voices talking about him, plans being made, scores waiting to be settled. Dean touched his swollen face gently, wincing at the pain. His hands trembled, something they had never done before. The fear he had so often inspired in others now lived in his own chest, a constant, gnawing presence. He thought about all the people he had put in cells like this, all the times he had laughed as he closed the door, all the power he had wielded so carelessly, so cruelly. Now he understood. The helplessness, the vulnerability, the knowledge that there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, no one to call for help. Dean pulled his knees to his chest, trying to make himself smaller in the darkness. Outside his cell, footsteps approached, guards making their rounds. They passed without stopping, without checking on him. He was just another inmate now, just another number in the system. The night stretched ahead of him, long and dark and full of fear. And he knew, with crushing certainty, that this was his new reality. Every day would be like this. Every night would bring this same terror. This wasn't just punishment, this was justice served cold and complete. James Carter stood before Congress, his posture impeccable in his perfectly pressed suit. The chamber was silent, except for the occasional shuffle of papers and click of cameras. Sunlight streamed through the high windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. His voice, when he spoke into the microphone, was steady and measured. Distinguished members of Congress, what I'm about to present isn't just about one corrupt officer, or even one corrupt precinct. What we've uncovered is a systematic network of corruption that spans multiple jurisdictions, multiple levels of government, and multiple decades. He opened the thick folder in front of him, though he hardly needed to reference it. Every detail, every name, every connection was burned into his memory after months of investigation. The case of Officer Dean Kavanaugh was merely the thread that, when pulled, began to unravel a tapestry of institutional corruption. Carter continued. What began as an investigation into police brutality revealed something far more sinister. A coordinated effort to target Black youth, falsify charges, and in many cases, make them disappear entirely. The chamber erupted in murmurs. Carter waited patiently for silence to return before proceeding. I will now present evidence that will name specific individuals who have participated in, facilitated, or covered up these crimes. Carter's voice remained calm, but his eyes held a fierce intensity. These names include Police Chief Richard Morrison of the 12th Precinct, Judge Marcus Hamilton of the Superior Court, District Attorney Sarah Wells. As each name left his lips, gasps and whispers rippled through the chamber. Carter continued methodically, each name accompanied by a stack of evidence: bank records showing suspicious deposits, email chains discussing cover-ups, surveillance footage, witness testimonies. Police Commissioner Thomas Bradley authorized the deletion of over 200 arrest records between 2018 and 2022. Judge Patricia Reynolds dismissed 47 cases involving police misconduct without proper review. Mayor William Chester's office redirected funds meant for community oversight into a slush fund used to silence victims' families. The evidence was overwhelming. Photos of missing teenagers flashed across the screens mounted in the chamber. Bank statements showed patterns of payoffs. Internal memos revealed coded language used to identify potential targets. These documents prove beyond any reasonable doubt that these officials worked in concert to create a system that specifically targeted Black youth, Carter stated. The pattern is clear: false arrests, fabricated charges, manipulated evidence, and in the most disturbing cases, coordinated disappearances. In their living room, Maya and Zuri Carter sat transfixed before the television. Maya gripped her sister's hand tightly as they watched their father systematically dismantle the corrupt system that had hurt them and so many others. "Look at his face," Zuri whispered. "He's not even angry. He's just determined." Maya nodded, touching her hair that had finally grown back. He's making sure they can never hurt anyone else again. Back in the congressional chamber, Carter's testimony had sparked immediate action. Representatives were already calling for emergency sessions. Phones buzzed with news alerts as the first wave of resignations began rolling in. Police Chief Morrison has tendered his resignation effective immediately, an aide whispered to the committee chair. Carter continued presenting evidence unmoved by the chaos his words were creating. He detailed how the corruption had spread, how it had been maintained, and how it had been protected for so long. The FBI has already begun coordinating with state authorities to execute search warrants, Carter announced. As we speak, raids are being conducted on offices throughout the city. We expect to recover additional evidence of crimes spanning at least 3 decades. The chamber erupted again as news started flooding in. FBI teams were entering government buildings across the city. Police precincts were being locked down. Judges were being escorted from their chambers. In light of these findings, Carter continued, I am recommending the immediate formation of a national task force to investigate similar patterns of corruption in other jurisdictions. This is not an isolated incident. This is a systemic problem that requires a systematic response. The committee chair leaned forward. Chief Carter, the scope of what you're suggesting, this would be unprecedented. So is the scale of this corruption, Mr. Chairman, Carter replied evenly. These aren't just civil rights violations. These are crimes against humanity, committed by the very people sworn to uphold the law. More alerts buzzed through the chamber. The mayor had announced an emergency press conference. The police union was in chaos. News helicopters circled government buildings, capturing footage of FBI agents carrying out boxes of documents. Maya and Zuri watched as their father concluded his testimony, his voice never wavering, his purpose never faltering. He had transformed their personal trauma into a catalyst for systemic change. He did it, Maya whispered, tears in her eyes. He really did it. Zuri squeezed her sister's hand. He did it for everyone, for all the others who didn't have someone to fight for them. As Carter gathered his materials, the chamber was in complete disarray. Representatives huddled in groups, making urgent phone calls. Staffers rushed back and forth with updates about the expanding investigation. He walked out of the hearing room, his steps measured and purposeful. A wall of reporters waited in the hallway, microphones thrust forward, questions shouted from every direction. Chief Carter, can you comment on the mayor's resignation? How many officials are expected to be indicted? What about similar cases in other cities? Carter moved through the crowd without stopping, his expression unchanged. The questions continued to fly, but he maintained his steady pace. His work wasn't finished. This testimony was just another step in a longer journey toward justice. Maya sat in the leather chair at Supreme Cuts, her eyes fixed on her reflection in the well-lit mirror. The barbershop hummed with the familiar sound of clippers and quiet conversation. Her fingers traced the uneven patches where her hair had started growing back, some areas longer than others, a constant reminder of that night at the precinct. Zuri stood behind her sister's chair, one hand resting supportively on Maya's shoulder. The barber, Ms. Tanya, waited patiently with her tools ready. You sure about this, honey? Ms. Tanya asked gently, meeting Maya's eyes in the mirror. Maya's reflection stared back with determination. Yes. This time it's my choice. Those words held power. This wasn't about hiding or erasing what happened. This was about reclaiming control. Ms. Tanya nodded, understanding in her eyes. She'd heard about what happened to the Carter twins. Everyone in the community had. She picked up her clippers and switched them on. The buzz filled Maya's ears as Ms. Tanya began working, carefully evening out the patches. Bits of hair fell onto the cape draped around Maya's shoulders. But unlike that night at the precinct, there was no fear, no shame, no cruel laughter. Just the gentle touch of caring hands and the warmth of her sister's presence. You look fierce, Zuri said, squeezing Maya's shoulder. Maya watched as the last irregular patches disappeared, replaced by a clean, intentional cut. Ms. Tanya worked with precision, transforming the reminder of trauma into a statement of strength. In the month since their father's congressional testimony, The sisters had refused to let their experience break them. Instead, they channeled their pain into purpose. Maya had discovered her voice as an advocate. What started as speaking at local community centers grew into addressing larger audiences. She shared her story with youth groups, particularly in underprivileged neighborhoods where police harassment was a daily reality. Her words carried weight because they came from lived experience. Last week's speech at the Youth Empowerment Summit really made an impact, Zuri said as she watched Ms. Tanya work. 3 different organizations called asking you to speak at their events. Maya nodded slightly, careful not to disturb Ms. Tanya's work. Those kids needed to hear that they're not alone, that they can fight back, not with violence, but with their voices and their truth. Zuri had found her own path forward. Her natural investigative instincts led her to journalism, where she could expose injustice through careful research and compelling storytelling. She'd already published several pieces in the school paper about systemic racism in law enforcement, backing every claim with meticulously gathered evidence. Got an interview tomorrow with another former officer who's willing to talk, Zuri mentioned. More stories keep coming out since Dad's testimony. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away in a maximum security prison, Dean Kavanaugh had become nothing more than a number. His badge, his authority, his very identity, all stripped away. The man who once terrorized others now lived in constant fear. The other inmates knew who he was, what he'd done. There was no protection for him here, no brotherhood of blue to hide behind. The guards looked the other way when he showed up in the infirmary with bruises and broken bones. His pleas for help went unanswered, just like those of his victims. His name was being erased from history, reduced to a cautionary tale about corruption and consequences. The very system he'd used to torment others now ensured his own torment, day after endless day. Ms. Tanya made her final passes with the clippers, ensuring everything was even and clean. She held up a hand mirror so Maya could see the back of her head. "Perfect," Maya said, running her hand over the smooth surface. "Exactly what I wanted." Ms. Tanya removed the cape with a flourish, brushing away loose hair. "You wear it well, baby, like a crown." Maya stood from the chair, standing tall as she examined herself from different angles. The cut emphasized her strong features, her determined eyes. She looked powerful, unafraid. "What do you think?" she asked Zuri. "I think you look exactly like who you are," Zuri replied. "Someone who can't be broken." The sisters gathered their things, Maya pausing to hug Ms. Tanya before they headed to the door. The bell chimed as they stepped out into the bright afternoon sunshine. They walked down the sidewalk together, heads held high, no longer scanning for patrol cars or walking in fear. Their steps were confident, matching each other's rhythm as they had done all their lives. Maya felt the warm breeze against her scalp, a sensation that once triggered painful memories but now felt like freedom. She had taken something meant to humiliate her and transformed it into a symbol of strength. Zuri glanced at her sister, noting the peace in her expression. "You good?" "Yeah," Maya said, smiling. "For the first time in a long time, I really am." They continued down the street, 2 young women who had refused to be defined by what was done to them. They had taken their pain and turned it into purpose, their fear into fuel for change. Their steps were light, unburdened by the weight of trauma that had once threatened to crush them. For the first time since that night, they were truly free. If you enjoyed the story of Officer Dean, I handpicked this next story that you will love. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it. Free. If you enjoyed the story of Officer Dean, I handpicked this next story that you will love. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.